Good evening, everybody. My name is Jerry Green, and I work at the Pacific Council. And I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. We are honored to host Mayor Eric Garcetti again for the Pacific Council, or I should say Mayor Garcetti and the Pacific Council's annual State of the Global City Address. Mr. Mayor, I want to thank you for joining us yet again for this very special event. I know we have a large number of guests with us in the audience this evening, and I especially want to welcome you. The Pacific Council is an independent, nonpartisan, and non-political. We are interested in politics, but we are nonpartisan in terms of our addressing political issues, and based in Los Angeles, and our focus is on international affairs. We have a membership comprising leaders and others in the community in excess of 1,200 people, many of them based in Los Angeles, but dispersed all around the world. If any of you have questions in Pacific Council membership or interest in Pacific Council membership, I would encourage you to talk to one of our staff members. They have badges with a red demarcation on the name tags, so feel free to talk to one of them. I really want to give special thanks to the R.M. Liu Foundation that not only made this. Not only did they make this event possible, but they were responsible for designing it. They, sort of being global people themselves, determined what Los Angeles needs, and so this is very much a result of their architecture. So I want to be specific and thank Bob, who has been on our board since I became president 10 years ago, Mimi, Justin, Emily, and the entire Liu family for not only supporting this, but for being so committed to Los Angeles being a global city. So thank the Liu family very, very much. Now, as I'm sure you all heard this morning on KNX, Ask the Mayor, which I listen to religiously, it is a great show. They talked about potholes, they talked about homeless issues, they talked about presidential politics, they talked about all of the normal range of things that one would talk about to the mayor of Los Angeles. Let me tell you what they left out. Our mayor, and I'm plagiarizing him because he says this, but he's absolutely right, is the mayor of the only Latin American, Asian, American city on the planet. Again, I'm plagiarizing his wife, who said that this is the most American of cities, and that is absolutely the truth. They did not mention that he is a Rhodes Scholar, that he is married to a Rhodes Scholar, so it is the ultimate smart person power couple. They did not mention that he's a former naval intelligence officer. They did not mention that he is bilingual. And I must say, we had Justin Trudeau speaking, not we, but spoke at the Reagan Library and was bouncing back and forth between French and English. I have heard Mayor Garcetti do this on countless occasions between English and Spanish in a way that really promotes inclusivity in a very important way. They did not mention that as a young man he spent time in Ethiopia. And basically, they did not acknowledge that he is a global mayor for a global city and a global age. So I think we're really lucky to have a mayor who, you know, despite doing a great job mayoring, which he does, understands our place in the universe in a way that is important not only for us, but the rest of the world. So I just, you know, being an international person, I want to thank you for being so committed to these issues. The final thing I want to say is that with some of the tumult in national capitals, not only Washington, but others around the world, we're now entering an era of subnational diplomacy and city and state leadership on global issues. The Pacific Council had a delegation in Brussels. We were visiting NATO and the EU, and they were very excited that Governor Brown was showing up to talk about climate issues. So this is not that we're replacing the federal government. We realize that we may be the most effective at telling our own story, given that California has the 6th largest economy in the world. We've got consuls general here, so I will not say who we are in front of, but they're big countries, and I think you would be surprised. This notion of subnational diplomacy is really very, very important and something that Los Angeles practices, I think, with great effect. I want to introduce the co-chair of the Pacific Council Board, Mark Nathanson. Where is he? Mark? Oh, there you are. I was looking at Adam, and who is a younger you, not that you're not unyoung. I want to turn the floor over to Mark Nathanson. Thank you all for coming, and thank the mayor.
On behalf of myself and my co-chair, Ambassador Rock Schnabel, we welcome you all. This is a membership organization, so we welcome new members. We want to hear from our existing members how we can do a better job. And this tonight is a very special evening. It's the second annual State of Global City Address by our brilliant young mayor, Eric Garcetti. Thank you again, Eric, for being here. Exploring and elevating Los Angeles in the local and national leadership is central mission to the Pacific Council. We are headquartered here in Los Angeles. We are West Coast centric as far as foreign policy is concerned, and we believe it is critical that people in Washington and other capitals in the world understand how we understand foreign policy from a unique Los Angeles perspective. After all, Los Angeles is the creative capital of the world. I'm pleased in our audience tonight, representing the global community, are over 20 consul generals. We're so pleased to have you there and to participate with you in many activities. We also have many college students, graduate students, Truman Fellows, and members of the LA College Promise Program who are interested in international relations. Please take a moment to talk to these students. They are the future leaders of tomorrow. Who knows? They may someday be mayor or secretary of state. I first met Eric when he was in high school playing around with Jeffrey Jangers and other kids. He was a bright young man. I never thought he'd be mayor. President, I thought he'd be president. I want to recognize the Liu family. They are so generous, they're so wonderful. They are encouraging, not only by this sponsorship, but helping young people get involved in world affairs. And it is my pleasure to introduce to the stage Justin Liu. Justin.
Welcome, everybody, and thank you for being here tonight. This is our second annual State of the Global City Address, and thank you, Mayor Eric Garcetti, for being here with us. So a year ago at this event, our mayor talked about the prospects of our city hosting an Olympics. Here we are a year later, and those Olympics are a reality. Also a year ago, on the heels of this event, preceding this event, our country had just inaugurated a brand new president. And going into the year, there was a lot of uncertainty about our country's foreign policy moving forward. And a year later, a lot of those questions probably still exist. And with that, the issues that impact us as citizens and our city specifically couldn't be more relevant than they are today. The Pacific Council originally started with the idea that the US foreign policy shouldn't be driven just by the viewpoints in the Northeast, but that the West Coast should have its own viewpoints and policy as well. In order to drive that narrative, the insights needed to come from the Pacific Council's member leaders of the past, present, and future. Our mayor epitomizes that arc of membership better than anybody else. As an early member of the Pacific Council, he moderated and led discussions on the issues and topics that were relevant to us in this region, but probably more personally to me as a young member. You mentored us, young members as well too, and helped us formulate and shape our viewpoints that really helped us create the conviction of the issues that matter to us. And for that, I thank you. And so with that, I take great comfort in knowing that our city is led by someone who not only understands the importance of global affairs in the city, but also has the knowledge of the depth and complexity of the issues to be able to lead that discussion now at a global level. So tonight, our mayor is going to give some opening remarks, and afterwards, he will be joined on stage by Ms. Karen Richardson. Thank you, Karen. Karen's a Pacific Council member, and she served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of Public Affairs during the Obama administration. And prior to her appointment in the State Department, she held various positions in President Obama's White House, including Associate Director of Public Engagement and Intergovernmental Affairs. Thank you for being with us tonight. So without further ado, it is my honor to introduce to you our city's 42nd mayor, Mayor Eric Garcetti.
Well, good evening. Thank you so much, Justin. Good evening, Pacific Council and friends. And what a joy it is to be back before you again on a rainy night here in this incredible city to assess Los Angeles' work in and our place in the world. But before I begin my remarks, let me make a few acknowledgments as well. Let me start with Robert, Mimi, Justin, Emily, and the Liu family, who have just been extraordinary. Great friends to me, to my administration, believers in what we've done, and we are so blessed to have a local foundation with such a global reach. And thank you for underwriting tonight and making that possible. Let's give them another round of applause. Let me thank, too, the leadership of the Pacific Council. The Pacific Council is fulfilling an absolutely critical role, not just in our world today, but in our region as well. To Jerry, to Mark, to Rock, to everybody who is a part of the board, to old members, new members, and by old we don't mean your age, we just mean the length of service. This organization really continues to set the standard in a moment in which you are so badly needed. I also want to acknowledge many former U.S. ambassadors that are in the audience with us today. Thank you for your important and excellent service to our nation. And if you'll indulge me for a second, I saw her, where is she? I want to single out Vilma Martinez, our former ambassador to Argentina, who has Ambassador Martinez has served you all here as the chair of our Port Commission, our Harbor Commission for the Port of Los Angeles. And she's let me break the news that she is retiring from that position tonight. She's got double thumbs up, but for 4.5 years, she has led the way, helped break records, which we'll get to in my speech at the port, and we have been so blessed by your service. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for all you have given us. Let me thank, too, the students that are here. I know they've already been thanked, but raise your hand if you're in college right now. All right, so that's how you can find the folks from our universities and colleges. We are so blessed to have your presence here. I always learn so much from my students, and I dare say this room can learn a lot from you. We'll see students this Saturday downtown speaking out on gun violence. We've watched how sometimes we older folks should just get out of the way and let you lead. And I'm so particularly pleased as well that our LA Promise students, we became the largest city in America to make community college free. That's now a state program inspired by us. And we're very excited to have our College Promise students that are here in the largest community college district in the country. And then finally, let me thank our incredible Consular Corps. We really are blessed with an extraordinary Consular Corps, one of the largest in the world, but I would say the best, one that is engaged and active, does an amazing job with our home countries. And Consular Corps really are honorary members, honorary Angelinos while they're here, and in just 2 weeks' time, we're going to have our first community service event with our Consular Corps, where we'll be at the LA Kitchen. We'll be preparing meals for older, low-income, and homeless Angelinos, and it really speaks volumes of our Consular Corps that you're going to be doing that with us, so thank you. So 14 months ago, I came before you for the first ever State of the Global City address. I was full of both unabashed hope locally and confronting a growing uncertainty nationally and globally. I described that hope that was rooted in my upbringing here in Los Angeles, to be of and in the world, to be in this pluralistic metropolis with parents whose values were passed on to me, to go out from that world and see LA in the world and vice versa, to see that world reflected back here in LA. And I talked about the progress we were making in international trade and jobs, in our Olympic bid and our aspirations in the world. I also talked 14 months ago about the looming uncertainty in our nation and in our world. 3 days after the inauguration of a new president, I came and spoke to you. I spoke to you about the growing divides between people, cultural, economic, geographic fissures, not unique just to our country but around the world, that threaten the peace, the social unity and security of our world. Just 5 days after I spoke, thousands of Angelenos headed to our airport to confront the challenge of the president's first attempt at an executive directive on immigration. Hundreds of visitors and migrants who expected to fully be welcomed to America were stuck in a gray limbo, unsure of their future, but we did what Angelenos do. We went out there and helped one another. We stood up for the values that have always guided us and that are shared, not just in this country, but among people around the world who seek a better globe. Last year, I also spoke about this city's leadership role, of what role we could play in making sure in these uncertain times that aren't just about an election, but changing technologies and the growth of a global economy, to make sure that LA could be a leader in the future of this world. This year, my assessment of the state of the global city is the same, but even stronger. Locally, I can share with you even more positive news than we had last year. On the flip side, nationally and globally, there is even more negative news that threaten our collective progress. So let me start with the good news. If you had just asked me to come here tonight to report on the global state of the city here locally, it's an extraordinary picture. Economically, in this past year, we set new trade records, tourism records, and foreign investment records. Culturally, our art scene is exploding. 3 months ago, the influential urbanist Richard Florida, who termed the term the creative class, said that Los Angeles was the most important art hub in America, with more artists living here both in per capita and absolute numbers than any other city in the United States. Sound stages in Hollywood are at capacity. And since I detailed our Olympic aspirations last year, our city won the largest cultural and athletic prize a city can win in the world, and we will, in 2028, host our 3rd Olympiad in the City of Angels. We don't always think of ourselves this way, but we are the 3rd largest economy in the world now. Municipal economy, that is. With Tokyo being first, New York second, we're nearly $1 trillion of gross municipal product. To put that in perspective, we're just a little bit behind our beloved Australia. I have to say that because is Australian Consul General here? We're almost as big as Australia. And it puts in perspective just what a huge presence Southern California is on the world stage. But then there's the bad news. The state of the globe and of our nation's foreign policy is described at best in flux, at worst, quickly disintegrating. We're unclear on our policies, from trade to security, multilateralism, and our defense commitments. We're unpredictable in our stances, from the Korean Peninsula to Europe and towards our adversaries. And we're undependable in our friendships. One day we're fascinated and friendly with you, the next day we're not. We seem obsessed with strongmen more than our longtime relationships. We've taken sides from the Middle East to the Philippines in ways that often undercut the values that America has stood for a long time. So the question for us tonight is what many of us are asking in our private conversations, what many of our friends around the globe are asking as well. Who are we as Americans? What do we seek to be and what do we seek to do in the world today? And sometimes it feels like the present is so loud that we can't hear the future. And yet we need to do both. We must continue to show the world who America is, which is never defined by one person or even a single political administration, but by an entire nation. And at the same time, we have to simultaneously prepare for a rapidly changing world and our role in ensuring that there is peace and prosperity in that for our people and for the people of all nations. As I did last year, I would argue that the answer to those two questions lie not in some distant place or in our nation's capital. They're right here, in this town, where we live, where we work, where we worship. This has been a great decade for the expansion of a global city. Our global economy is expanding here in Los Angeles. You can just count the cranes downtown, and you know that we're open for business. And many of those largest developments are funded by foreign investment. In fact, foreign investment creates hundreds of thousands of jobs in Southern California, the equivalent of an entire American city. LA tourism, as I mentioned, hit new records as we welcomed nearly 50 million visitors to our town last year. LAX became the fourth busiest airport in the world, the busiest airport of origination and destination in America. And there have been 70 new international nonstop flights since I became your mayor that we've been able to sign agreements on. That's a staggering statistic. The Port of Los Angeles is the busiest in the Western Hemisphere with 9.3, yep, 9.8, we're going to 9.3 million TEUs, which is a lot of boxes, the equivalent of about 300 to 470, if you count our sister port in Long Beach, $1 billion of goods that came into this country. Global culture is thriving here, as I mentioned. I don't know how many of you went to Pacific Standard Time, but the Getty Foundation brought together dozens of institutions that showed our strong links to Latin America as we highlighted Latin American art and homegrown Latino art at places like Mocha just down the street. The Broad is breaking records. LACMA has the largest expansion of any museum in this country. The AMPAS, the Motion Picture Academy, is almost halfway done with its museum right next door to LACMA. And just last week, we broke ground on the largest single cultural gift in American history for the Lucas Museum of Narrative Art, something we also were competing for last year, but got the good news is coming here to LA. When we look at Netflix and $7 billion that they're investing, and Apple quickly behind them looking to replicate that as well, our legacy studios and music companies, we're creating more content that goes around the world than ever before. And you just have to read Jonathan Gold's columns or walk a few blocks in any direction in this town to know that the food scene in Los Angeles is second to none in the world. King Tut, we announced this morning, is in town for 9 months. He's back for his 3rd visit. He loves vacationing here so much. And better than that, yeah, go see it. It's going to be at the California Science Center. We are the first city in the world. Side note, it's the last time he'll be here because some of the proceeds will help build a permanent museum in the shadow of our sister cities' famous pyramids in Giza for a permanent home for all of those artifacts. But there's a reason they chose LA as the first place in the world to bring that exhibition. And as I mentioned, we have the chance to be a games changer in 2028 when we host for the 3rd time the Olympic Summer Games and the 1st time the Paralympic Games here in Los Angeles. But our global connections are also strengthening here in Los Angeles. In the first part of this year, I had the honor of welcoming representatives from 2 great American allies, Canada and Australia. Prime Minister Trudeau and Julie Bishop were here. We sat down and highlighted how important Los Angeles is to those nations and how important those nations are to Los Angeles. And in recent months, I appointed the first deputy mayor of international affairs in any major American city, Pacific Council member and former ambassador to ASEAN, Nina Hachigian. Stand up, stand up. Who oversees this city's first Office of International Affairs with trade, diplomacy, and the Olympics under her portfolio. Right now, we are working, too, to make sure that the next generation of Angelenos feels those ties, not just on the streets of LA, but in their opportunities to actually visit and to be a part of cultures globally. We're working with the Consular Corps so that they can go directly into some of our public schools and teach our young people about their countries. We're working with a few consulates to pilot a program this year to send College Promise students overseas for a week or 2 during the summer to supplement their education. And in collaboration with the Pacific Council and with support from the Liu Foundation, College Promise students will join some Pacific Council trips over the next 5 years, which will enrich our experiences and their lives. I know what trips like that, to live, to study, to work abroad did for me, to shape who I am today. And I am so excited to see the next generation of Angelenos at a time when it feels like the country is turning into itself to reopen those ties to the world and for our city. We see global opportunities simply everywhere, from investment in WME in Saudi Arabia to the Panda Restaurant Group in Mexico, from AECOM in Qatar and to Gensler in Shanghai, and the list could go on. We are opening up markets, creating jobs here locally, and promoting prosperity in the nations with whom we trade. But foreign policy is a little trickier. Since the beginning of our nation, we have been engaged in the world since we fought for our independence against an overseas ruler. And our foreign policy is often described along the same schools of thought that we describe in international relations, that dominate that kind of dichotomy between what some describe as realism and others call idealism/liberalism. Realism, simply defined, is kind of that dog-eats-dog world. Only power matters. There's chaos in a zero-sum game, and you have to do what you need to do to make your country strong. The school of thought of idealism or liberalism says that institutions and the promotion of shared values should guide our decisions and further help secure peace and prosperity out of a chaotic world. And I think in America we've always been a combination of both. We're not overly romantic, but we're still idealistic. And while we proudly promote universal values from human rights and democratic participation, we've always been realists about engagements and promoting international security in our nation as well. Unlike what we hear from Washington these days, there is no dichotomy between patriotism on one hand and global purpose on the other. Just as America can lead the world for a common good and deliver for its people, so can LA as well be a global city and do well for ourselves and our people. In other words, there's a virtuous reinforcement between these two things. We have traditionally held that the embracing of engagement and the promotion of one's own values act in our own and in everyone's benefit. But today, that strong foundation of post-World War II and even post-Cold War global relations faces its toughest challenge, domestically and internationally. We see a global economy in which labor has really become a commodity, where companies are less loyal to their workers than to what they can do for their stock price. We have the existential challenge of climate change, which is perhaps the greatest threat that humanity has ever faced. We have security threats that now traverse borders. We have a rise of nostalgic nationalism, not just in the United States, but in other nations as well. And the rise of new powers, new values, the decaying of some traditional institutions and values, and a rise in some parts of the world of a new authoritarianism. Those threats and those changes have resulted in real dislocation for workers, insecurity for entire communities, and new conflict in what we thought were previously stable regions. And our response hasn't been a strengthening of our idealistic realism. There isn't even the zero-sum game world of strict realism coming out of Washington, D.C. Instead of realism, I would say what we see coming out of Washington, D.C. is best described as American surrealism. The only rule is there are no rules. The myths of might are more important than material accomplishments. What we say is more important than what we do. And weakness and experience can be hidden by distracting. Truth can be whatever you fantasize or feel it to be. So what are we to do in this context? Who do we want to be in America, and what do we want to do? We can only hide for so long. We can only keep a leadership deficit at bay for so long before we actually start to weaken this country and weaken the world itself. And this isn't just something we seek to see. Now is a time for all of us to reinforce and to remember what I will call the 3 A's: our aspirations, our allies, and our actions. First, our aspirations. I believe that we should aspire to have a shared culture internationally. I don't mean that in cultural terms of religion or ethnicity or language, but a cultural understanding of how we act and that we care for one another. I would describe it as something around faith, freedom, and the future. Faith, again, not in religious terms, but in humanistic terms, that the global family is something we have to believe in order for it to exist. Freedom not only in the sense of human rights and democracy, but in the sense of economic freedom, at a moment when so many Americans and so many global citizens don't feel that they have economic freedom, whether it's the high price of college here in this country, insufficient access to capital around the globe. That sense of insecurity for all domestic leaders must be confronted and dealt with. And the future. We can't keep looking to the past, to a past many of us don't want to bring back, that excluded too many of us, but also one in which we weren't investing in the technology and the changes that were coming. So first, our aspirations around faith of each other, freedom in this economy, and the future. Second A is our allies. After we've embraced a vision of our shared aspirations, we have to build a network of allies, of friends. Friends and friendship matters in life, in your family, in a city, in a nation, and I would say in international relations as well. We know that in Los Angeles. We engage our sister cities. We have more than any city in the world. We're the most promiscuous sister city in the world. But that leads us to friendship, to investments, to cultural exchange, to educational collaboration. It leads us to participate in the US-China Climate Leaders Summit that we hosted here so that we can have healthier skies over Shanghai and Los Angeles. Even among competitors, we must see that cooperation matters and that we can establish and enforce rules together that we all can follow. The third A is our actions. Aspirations are the foundation of global relations, and our relationships with allies and institutions enable us to create a common space to act, but it is what we produce in the end that we should be judged by. Certainly mayors are. We understand this in local government. In cities, we can't afford the luxury of just playing politics. We have to keep trains running on time, literally and figuratively. We have to show up at work. We have to pick up our children. We have to educate our young people. We have to balance budgets. We have to invest in our ports and our airports, as we're doing here, where we unload, move our goods and our people. So these three A's, what we aspire to, how we ally with one another, and what actions we collectively produce will make or break the future of our world and certainly of our city. As I mentioned before, this past year I took the final steps in what was a 4-year journey to land the Olympics. It's the most intense political campaign with the fewest number of voters I have ever participated in. And there were twists and turns. We didn't even get the original US nomination, losing that to Boston, then getting it. Competitors that had head start and much more time on us, unexpected exits. And we had a national election that caused many Olympic officials to directly question me and America's commitment to global engagement, saying, "You sure you want to bring the Olympics? Because it doesn't sound like that coming out of your country's foreign policy." But we ultimately won that bid, not by denying America, but by showing America to the world. By saying, yes, we do have a tradition throughout our history of being able to turn into ourselves. And this is one of those moments where the rhetoric and the actions seem to be launching that way if you listen to what's coming out of the White House. But think of what the Olympics did for us in 1984, in 1932, when we helped save the Games both of those times, and we can do it again. And we recognize that our obligations, our engagement, our friendship wasn't just with our own nation, but with the entire world. We showed off a quintessentially Californian and essentially American bid that embraced our inclusive values, our aspirations, embraced our global relationships, our allies, and pointed to our past successes in running the Games, our actions, those three A's again. And we won by a combination of international diplomacy and know-how, negotiating in the end a win-win-win for the Olympics, for Paris, and for us. In exchange for going 4 years later, after Paris, we got money up front for the first time a decade before the Olympics have come to a city, ensuring that our young people can have access to sports and healthier lives this year in 2018, not a year or two after the Games. We knew that our values were our strength. And so for all of us now, using that metaphor, accepting this deal, winning a second prize, the change to look at the horizon a decade ahead, now in 2028, we can ask ourselves the question, who do we want to be a decade from now? When the world comes to our city, every nation, every competitor, every media outlet will be here, what Los Angeles and what America will they find? Let me offer you a vision of that. First, I want to see an LA that creates economic prosperity for all of our people by investing in the industries of the future and engaging with the connections of the globe. It surprises many people to know that in this great pluralistic trade hub, only 1% of our businesses trade globally. So we've set, with Nina's team, Felipe Kuzner, who's the head of international trade for me, a goal to double that. We've already worked with over 1,000 companies to teach them how to trade globally. Sometimes we get so caught up on the rules of trade, we forget to engage in the action of trade. That's where cities can make a difference. In the midst of talk on talk of tariffs on goods, we forget to talk about our trade in services, which is a surplus for this nation. And when you look at those biggest categories, first, $200 billion from tourism here in Los Angeles. We didn't just set new records, we had more people come last year as the rest of international tourism went backwards in the rest of the nation, because we consciously went forward with values that said everyone is welcome here. In fact, that was our campaign to advertise globally. We must make the connection for economic prosperity between that international engagement with everyday workers, with the carpenter who's at the Wilshire Grand, knowing that Korean investment has resulted in his or her family being able to have food on the table when they come home. The longshore worker at the port unloading the goods, the animator in Universal City, the jeans sewer here in downtown. We have to make that connection for them of why this engagement matters. Second, a decade from now, I want to see LA as a place where the world belongs. As I mentioned, our LA tourism promotion was called Everyone is Welcome Here. And that's who we are, whether it was at the airport or whether it was looking at bringing those tourists here. We now know that LA is a place that, from China to Armenia, from Mexico to Canada, is the #1 choice for people to come, visit, study, work, and invest. And we need to keep that momentum going. Third, I'd like to see in 2028 LA as a city that is leading Pacific engagement. And the Pacific Council is a huge part of that. Make no mistake, without this organization, our leadership would be greatly diminished. But when we look at Asia, Latin America, we need to be hosting more gatherings. We need to have those G8 and those G20 and those multinational meetings right here, because we're not the future, we're the present and the future right now in Los Angeles. Fourth, I want to see an LA that is a place that is busy solving the world's problems, from urban infrastructure to our health concerns, global warming, air pollution. Our engagement as a city has been a kind of conscious city foreign policy. I'm the vice chair of C40, started by Mike Bloomberg and funded by many foundations, including Bloomberg Philanthropies, to bring mayors and cities together to confront global climate change. The 100 Resilient Cities Network, we were chosen and just released 2 weeks ago our Resilient City Plan with the help of the Rockefeller Foundation. We're part of a network, and my chief resilience officer is in Mexico City presenting that, which was praised by Rockefeller as the best plan ever put forward globally by a city on resilience. Our Sustainable Development Goals, the Hilton Foundation, has brought these UN concepts into City Hall, where we are looking at the impact of everything from health indicators to our housing, our environmental work, our gender equity in a city. Because we know our national government right now doesn't say many good things about the United Nations, but we as a city can be a part of a growing global network that will implement them in our own municipalities. And the Hilton Foundation also brought home the Hilton Humanitarian Prize, something I hope stays here, but is evidence that LA isn't a secondary global city. We are top tier. Cities are the original unit in many ways of international relations. As I conclude my opening remarks here before our question and answer, I want to share with you a quote. When you think about it, international relations started mostly between city-states, way back when. And so it's fitting that above City Hall, in the highest point in City Hall in the Tom Bradley Ballroom, where we have quotations, that Aristotle has from Politics, one quotation I love, that is, the city came into being to preserve life, but it exists for the good life. In other words, cities were built with the fortifications and the security of making sure that you could be someplace where your physical body was safe. But that's not the end goal of either cities or international relations. It's to find and to define what the good life is. We do things in cities. We house people, we move people, we educate people, we inspire people, we trade goods, we clean our air. We don't have any time for the partisan politics or the silliness of Washington rhetoric. We've got too much work to do. In short, we are pragmatic and we are experienced. But we know that embracing inclusivity and engagement is not only right, it also helps those other things work well. For a city that has embraced its role in international relations, I would offer a philosophical articulation of what I have said here tonight. That here in Los Angeles, we practice a municipal pragmatism that's rooted in a Pacific optimism. In LA, in other words, we get things done, and we still know we have a long way to go with many things. But we are seeing the turning of a page, a great decade of investment in the physical and human infrastructure of our proud city. In LA, we build tunnels and bridges and terminals while others pursue their surrealist fantasies of impenetrable border walls. In LA, we protect our citizens while others divide and, even worse, denigrate them. In LA, we fight fires caused by drought brought on by climate change while others deny that it's even happening. We see the world as it is, and we seek to make it better. This is not to say, though, that we do not dream. We do. The Olympics, the turning back of traffic, the housing of all of our residents, the promotion of a city of belonging, we have dreams. And our dreams are not surreal abstractions nor partisan divisions. Our dreams are rooted in the highest aspirations that we share across party lines and ethnicity and religion and geography. Here, our dreams stretch up to the clouds as International Capital helps us reshape the downtown skyline while providing those material benefits to the families of the workers who put the steel and the pipes and the wires and the windows together. Here, our dreams stretch towards the future as we compete and win that chance to convene the world back in our city, in our neighborhoods, amidst our stadia and our fields for the 2028 Olympic and Paralympic Games. Here, our dreams stretch out to include everybody, welcoming visitors and migrants alike to bring their brilliance, to bring their commitments to building a city of the future. We prepare to dream every single night when we go to sleep, just before as we watch the pink sun kiss the Pacific horizon off our coast. As we close our eyes, we can see that world that we aspire to and that city that we aspire to be a part of. We're all Angelenos, eagerly await the new day, to embrace that work and to share that work with the world. Let's go do it. Thank you very much.
Optimistic.
Good. I'm glad.
Excellent. Well, thank you again. I think I speak for all of us when I say that it is an honor to have you here and to be in conversation and to hear from you. So I'm going to start on a high note.
Yes.
But maybe focusing a little bit on the bad news that you mentioned in your address. And you talk about the global state being in flux. You talk about the American surrealism. And last year when you were here, even sort of chronicling the sort of state of uncertainty, the state of maybe pessimism that was feeling, the idea that the earth was shifting beneath our feet that you mentioned, there still was a sense of hope and optimism on your part in terms of possibly being able to work with the then incoming administration, new administration, on things of energy, regulation, immigration. But now that we are a year in, and there's the global state is in flux, and there's still that uncertainty, I still feel a sense of optimism about what's next. And so the question is, how do we sort of get there? Laying out your vision, how do we get there, and what does that look like in practical terms? Because I still feel optimistic about the future after your speech. So, and how does that sort of impact, your international engagement plans for 2018 and beyond?
Well, it's interesting, When Eleanor Roosevelt was helping draft the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, she said that, and I'll badly paraphrase, but something along the lines of, after all, where do human rights begin? In faraway lands and distant places? No. In places so small, they're not found on any human map. The places where we work, where we live, where we go to school, where we worship. And if human rights don't mean anything there, they don't mean anything anywhere. And I think it's the same thing with global relations, that they actually are local, right? If you take away all local politics and action, there are no global relations. And so don't cede the power that you have before you try and exercise it. It's really nicer when you're congruent with your national government. But whether it was going to be President Trump or President Clinton, most of the work I described we'd still need to be engaged in. For instance, when President Trump withdrew from the Paris Climate Accords, a lot of people were angry and upset and probably spent hours on their Facebook feed. I didn't. I picked up the phone, I chair a group called Climate Mayors, and I got 398 and counting cities to say, if he's out, we're in, and we will implement it locally. So when I was in Berlin, and people were coming up to me, our sister city, one of our sister cities, and they were saying, what's going on with America last summer? I could say, don't worry about it. Those cities combined have the population of Germany. Americans do care about climate change. We are engaged and we are moving forward. So I find hope and optimism just by looking around me. I'd say 80 to 90% of the game has always been locally. And the last optimistic note is mayors and cities are getting together in a way they never have before. So we know each other, we talk to each other globally and nationally, and we push each other. So we're accelerating the good things that are happening because we see an amazing program like, I go to Beijing and speak at Peking University about how we cleaned up our air so that Beijing can have the same experience. That's something we can teach them. On the flip side, they're making all their buses electric in 2 years. I've set a goal by 2030, and they can teach us something. So there's a real exchange both directions, and I think that's the way that municipalities are breathing a lot of hope back.
Excellent. And on a related note, piggybacking off of that, because of these issues, and a lot of your address spoke about connecting the local to the global. You talked about mayors and how you're getting together with mayors on climate change. You were, a big supporter of the Paris Climate Agreement at its inception, of course, and continuing to do so. And then mayors are, confronting issues such as rising urbanization, the threat of climate change again, and the position, of cities at the nexus of many of these transnational sort of issues. And that we're seeing cities that are becoming more internationally engaged. So the question there is, it might make one wonder whether cities are no longer looking to their national governments for solutions, but looking to each other for them. And so what does this actually say about maybe the future of or the state of the nation state? And I think this is something you can speak on as an international relations professor, as well as mayor, and maybe speak to the dynamic that we're seeing in that context.
Well, I think the demise of the nation state has been grossly exaggerated. There's always moments when people are like, oh, it's the end of nationalism. And I think nationalism, as we see, is a very, very powerful force. And in a good way. I don't take nationalism as a dirty word. It's my area of kind of academic study that I looked at for years. It can be the biggest, the strongest force to unify people around shared values in a positive way, too. And I think in some ways what we had in the last election was one version of nationalism. It excluded a lot of us, but it was at least a national identity. And we didn't have one really defined on the other side. And people do hunger for identity, especially in chaotic times. And so I think we do have to answer that question for ourselves, and other nations are struggling with this too. What does it mean to be Hungarian? What does it mean to be American? What does it mean to be Russian? What does it mean? Who are we? And we have to find positive articulations of that. I don't think that national governments are going anywhere anytime soon. I agree with Jerry. I do think a stronger network of cities has emerged at the same time, and that even in the past, most things happened locally. One other change that I'm concerned with is many of our cities used to be linked together nationally. Our economies were very closely tied with supply chains to our smaller and medium-sized cities. And LA is one of those winner cities that is doing very well and is very well connected with Beijing and Shanghai and Seoul and Tokyo and London and New York and Mexico City. But we're less connected with Fresno, and we're less connected with Mesa. And the work that we need to do in America is to make sure that we don't just have the cities that are winning and the others that are left behind. So we have to bring global relations, I think, to those medium-sized cities and those ones that aren't in just the glamour areas.
So late last year, the Pacific Council hosted Commissioner Penny Abeyewardena. She's the commissioner of Mayor de Blasio's Office of International Affairs, where we talked about the importance of having such an office in a large city, a diverse city such as Los Angeles and New York. And your administration, as you mentioned, recently established an Office of International Affairs led by our very own Ambassador Nina Hashedian. So what was your vision for creating this office, given LA's unique assets, so to speak, and as well as appointing an ambassador to lead it?
Well, it was a combination both of what we needed and who we needed. Nina was the right person at the right time for the right job, an extraordinary mind and great experience as a representative of this nation. But also at the same time, structurally, I just looked at our book of business and how much it was growing and how understaffed we were. And we really needed to, I think, put that emphasis. Our port, as I mentioned, is the biggest in this country. The airport goes back and forth between second and third, but number one for people get on and off the plane, as opposed to hub travel. We have, there's hardly a week that goes by where there's not a governor of a Mexican state, a head of state, a mayor. I mean, we have so many people coming, and with the Olympics coming, we will be hosting more and more and more of this. And I really also secondarily wanted to see what can we do to help local businesses connect with the global economy. Not a lot of cities are doing that in a methodical way. They're not saying, here's how you get accredited, here's how you market. And whenever we go on those trips, we sometimes leave the countries, and local companies that are not big multinationals already have deals in those countries before they leave. And it never fails to surprise me. We have a sister city relationship with Guangzhou and with Auckland. Auckland and Guangzhou are sister cities. So we started something called a tripartite summit. It sounds pretty random, right? Like LA, Guangzhou, Auckland together. We were in Guangzhou, we had great meetings. Guangzhou and LA have a very proud history together. Then we hosted them the second year. The third year we're going to Auckland, and I have to be honest with you, I'm like, I don't know if there's going to be much business there. We brought about 100 tech entrepreneurs, and we did as much business as we did in Guangzhou. And if we hadn't shown up and done that, we wouldn't have been able to create that. So I think the world is waiting for us to get in contact with it and to bring the brilliance of the companies that we have, the goods and services we create. And maybe we change that conversation about tariffs. Maybe we still have rules we have to get to. I'm sure we'll talk about it. But maybe the conversation would be about how much we're growing prosperity rather than how we're all going to go back into our shells, which is probably historically going to hurt everybody.
Okay. And I'll ask one more question before I turn it to our great audience for questions. I see one right there. But when I was at the State Department, then Secretary of State John Kerry announced an initiative called Engage America. And the aim of that initiative was to communicate to the American people the tangible benefits of our diplomatic work abroad right here in different cities in the US. So how important is that to you? Because we're talking about jobs when you're going abroad and trade and how that's actually impacted here as it concerns the economy, et cetera. How important is it to you as mayor, and how are you going about that in terms of being able to connect what you're doing abroad and your international travel with the international office to how that actually translates into something tangible for your constituents?
Well, I hope that, let me start with security terms first. I hope that everybody knows what line Secretary Mathis, I think, has said, which is, if you don't invest in diplomacy, you better buy me some more bullets. And I hope that we all recognize the importance, regardless of who's in power, of having a strong State Department and engaging in diplomacy, of talking, engaging with one another. I think from a security standpoint, first and foremost, it helps prevent the loss of life of our own, my former fellow service members, but there's a real human cost to our military engagements if we break down and don't have diplomacy. Second is I hope that our next Secretary of State will invest in positions again in our State Department. It's confusing for our friends and our collaborators and even our competitors. It is something that really takes away some of the formal power that this world needs. And one thing with the Olympics, it was very fascinating to see people, there are things that the world sometimes, I think wrongfully so, but loves to hate about America, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that they love to love about America. But universally, every private conversation I had with people, everybody had some connection to America. They had studied here, they had a family member here. It was an emotional connection. And at its best, diplomacy transcends just the formal discussions and really is about human relations and a gut feeling and friendship and a connection that we need. And I think Americans don't know how little we spend. This room does, but less than 0.5% really of our GDP of our budget, on those global diplomacy engagements, and we really do need to. And I say that to the Trump administration. I hope the Trump administration engages much more in diplomacy and fills those positions, because whether it's a Republican or Democrat in power, we absolutely depend on that.
Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to open it up to the audience for questions. I saw your hand up first, sir. Yes, right. Yes, you. All right.
Thank you for an excellent international speech, Mr. Mayor. My name is Richard Neff. Just taking it from impressive, lofty rhetoric to underneath the bridges and looking at the infrastructure on the premise that a great city, great international city, needs a great infrastructure. I think that's where, putting aside the size of the port or something like that, where LA really falls down. It can't move its people effectively. Ridership on Metro is declining. I see the homeless deadline, despite all the funding, has been pushed, according to today's LA Times, to 2028 or something like that, 2020 something. And it's kind of a terrible problem in this city and other cities as well. In other cities I've lived in, the traffic moved one direction in morning rush hour and the other in evening rush hour. Nothing like that happens in Los Angeles. What is being done, and all of this antedates you, but what is being done over the last 4 or 5 years to address all of this and make it a really great city where we're not told to stay home in 2028 so people can get to Olympic venues?
Yeah, of course.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, I think if anybody who was here in 1984 remembers, it was no traffic. We did it great. And I think half the people who were for the 2028 Olympics said, even if it's just 17 days a decade from now, go for it, because I want to know that there will be some days with no traffic. But I take your point. It's where I consume my day. This is the Rare Talk. I spend 95% of my time probably on those two issues, which are immensely complex. They're both our housing crisis and our traffic is the articulation of that this is a city that people still want to be in. I mean, it's a different problem than a Detroit or a Pittsburgh in the past that didn't have traffic, people left. And it's a failure of us to build the infrastructure for the amazing investment and growth and popularity that we have here. And I understand people's impatience because it's the most heartbreaking part of my day, going through my city and seeing people in tents. But I'm committed to that ending. No goals was pushed out. When we went to the voters, we said these are 2 10-year initiatives through what would be 2028. With Measure H countywide, a sales tax, and then locally in the city of LA to build 10,000 units of supportive housing for our worst off homeless. And I feel while I feel as depressed as I've ever been on that stuff, I also feel more optimistic than I ever have been. A lot of people say, why do we still have homelessness? Didn't I vote for that last year? The money only started coming October 1st for the county measure. We put 1,000 positions to hire out, which is so exciting for me. There was only 25 outreach workers for the entire county at our Homeless Services Authority when I became mayor. I said that was ridiculous. We put our political capital on the line with both that and Measure M, the largest transportation measure in this nation's history, ×2. So what we have is basically in both of those now finally resources that you'll begin to see, I think, in the second half of this year, depending on the housing side, whether we keep pushing people into homelessness. So really briefly on that, let me speak to that. We have about 99,000 people just in the city of LA, 4 million. People a year who are coming out of prison or jail into the city of LA, 25 to 35% of them homeless. If the state, and the county, and the federal government doesn't give us help to catch them in those first couple hours, we're finding a lot of them winding up on the street. Drugs have never been cheaper. The trauma of untreated mental health or previous addiction. We can't police or steam clean our way out of this, and that's the power that I have, those sorts of things, the police and the public works. So these new engagement teams, and together with what is wonderful to see, we have Elise Buick here from the United Way. We launched last week with about 600 people something called Everyone In, which I hope you will join us in, which is saying, now that I voted for these things, I want to have housing in my neighborhood that will take people off the street. And we polled it, absolutely. And over Contrary to what you might read sometimes in the LA Times, because you can always find the person against it, 2/3 of Angelenos say, I want housing in my neighborhood for homeless folks. And that's a sea change from a decade ago, because we've worked on this. You know, you go to Sunland Tujunga, and people living in the River Wash there, most of them grew up in Sunland Tujunga. You're more likely to be from Los Angeles if you're homeless than if you're not. So we need to house people where they already are, where they know, and we have to do it everywhere in the city. So the city council's taken the pledge for 3,000 of those units in the next few years. We're looking at every parking lot, every empty piece of surplus land that we have, and we're building on that. For the traffic, I'm not as worried. You know, public transportation is down everywhere, but less down here, and we move 1.5 million people a day. It's still a really critical piece of our transportation puzzle. But we've never had it really get from point A to point B unless you win the lottery. Unless you happen to be right there where the line is built and your job happens to be where it is, we haven't had enough lines. This is 15 rapid transit lines that will be expanded or built, and 787,000 jobs created, by the way. And the last piece of this, we don't have enough time to talk about, is we have to plan the city well. You can't just build a new transit line if you don't build affordable housing along it, because it'll push people off who are the very same people you're trying to give quicker options to. I'll give you one example. We have the West Santa Ana branch line, which will come here downtown all the way to Artesia through the southeast cities, where we have all the industrial heartland of Los Angeles, factories, working class, folks who live there who have never had public transportation. It'll be the first brand new line that will get built as part of Measure M. We have to make sure all the land that we acquire builds housing that will keep people who work in those factories there. Because if it's just professionals who say, oh, I didn't know it was 10 minutes to the southeast of downtown. Huntington Park's that close? I thought that was a distant place. Huntington Park's the equivalent of like going to MacArthur Park in terms of the distance from downtown. But because it's on the east side, people think it's like way off there. And if we push people further out, we'll have worse traffic, worse pollution, et cetera. So I feel more optimistic than I ever have that those two things will radically change the look of the city. And by 2028, I want people to have realistic expectations. We can end homelessness on the streets of LA. It will require all of us stepping up and everybody being in.
I'm going to look to the right side. Ma'am? Yes, you?
Aparna Mukherjee. I'm a Fuse Fellow who just moved to New York to join the team at City Hall.
Welcome aboard.
Thank you. And it's in part because of that engagement LA has with the world at large. And I'm curious in part because right now the US is so on the global stage about an activism and a sense that we're in a political moment with students engaging in marches, this sense of advocacy and energy. And I'm wondering from the perspective of translating that into civic engagement and moving beyond the electoral outcomes, which I think because a lot of us in this room are focused on policy and long-term outcomes, how you see that translating, and are there cities, including sister cities, where you love how that's being expressed?
I love what? I missed the last piece.
Oh, how other cities, including sister cities, have examples of how this is being expressed and articulated.
How they're doing civic engagement? Yeah. I love, by the way, electoral engagement. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that's actually really important. There's midterm elections. I'm so impressed that the kids who are walking out are also registering people to vote. I mean, like, that's where it starts. So I wouldn't dismiss that. Secondly, I think that it's really critical, as the French philosopher Renan once said, the nation is a daily plebiscite. The flip side is that we often fetishize the once every year, 2 years, 4 years elections, and that's like participation, when really it's what are you doing today? As I said both times I spoke at the Women's March, the 2 largest marches in LA history, and the 2 largest marches in the country back-to-back years. I said we're going to be judged not by what we say today, but what we do tomorrow. If you care about women's rights, for instance, tomorrow, to your question, go to the Downtown Women's Center and help a woman come off the street who is a survivor of domestic or sexual violence. If you care about women, get involved with CAST, the Coalition to Abolish Slavery and Trafficking, which is the average age of a girl who's trafficked into sex work in this city is 13 years old. Change that and get involved with them tomorrow. If you care about women's rights and you're a woman, go run for something. And 20,000 women are in this country. So those ways that we can teach people to be involved, and especially young people, to let them know you don't have to be a voting age to work on an election or to get engaged and involved. I brought 17 students from our local schools together the day before the walkouts on gun violence to have a conversation. And I invited the press to be there. And I tried to make the shortest remarks I could when we invited the press in afterwards, after the conversation. and got out of the way, and for 40 minutes the students got to speak, and they were on the evening news. And they were much more articulate than me. They were so good, they owned that moment. I was asked by a lot of parents the next day to come to their kids' school, and I refused to. I said, this isn't a day for politicians to show up. This is a day for the students to feel and to see their own power. And I think we have to teach that to young people, that they really can make that difference through direct actions, through organizing themselves. And the very last thing I'll say is it's really important, though, to pass on the wisdom. You need a plan. A hashtag isn't enough. Getting people's attention isn't enough. You then have to really think through where do you want to take that attention and where do you want to take that momentum. And I've seen too many things recently kind of get the burst of the kind of cause of the moment, but not necessarily be able to translate that further on.
Okay. Speaking of students, I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. So are there any students in the audience that want to ask a question? If so, stand. Yeah. I can't see, no hands raised? Okay.
Alex Michelson for the...
Okay.
We can pretend you're a student.
The future leaders of tomorrow knows. Okay. All right. Sir, you're up.
All right. Good to see you.
Good to see you, too.
Thank you.
Microphones incoming. There you go.
Thank you.
Alex Michelson,
Alex
ABC
Michelson.
Channel 7.
There you go. Actually, I'm at Fox 11 now, but yeah.
You moved?
Yeah,
Wow.
I moved. Yeah.
They got you a better deal, huh?
If anybody wants to
Congratulations.
watch, yeah,
Good
4:30 in the morning. So, thanks for the plug.
Awesome.
So, a lot of people in this room think you're thinking about running for president. I know you feel free to make news tonight, but I'm sure you're probably not going to. But whoever becomes president next is going to come to an America that's so divided, where you have some people who are actually watching fake news and think it's real news. You have people that are calling real news fake news. And you have two parties that do not seem to be even listening to each other to have a discussion, much less come together. How does whoever takes on that role, both from a city perspective and from a national perspective, start to break that cycle so that some of this incredible caustic animosity that's going on in this country right now changes and the country can come together?
I always think that elections are the contrast to the election before. Often people make the mistake of, I'll be the me version of that guy. Like, you know, all the talk about, for Democrats, that we need a businessman who can beat Trump. Or businesswoman. And I always think that whether you're popular or unpopular, elections are always a contrast to what's there before. And I think you're seeing an awakening across America, even across people's political beliefs, that they want some decency and they want some calm back. This has been maybe a fun ride for some, an addiction for others, a depressing moment that you can't keep hitting refresh on your browser, but that we want something where we want examples for our children. You're seeing a lot of mothers getting active in places that have kind of been written off. There was a great article about college-educated white women in rural and suburban red counties that are getting engaged against this president. I also think that all of these dichotomies, these divisions, are absolutely overstated. Coast versus the heartland, urban versus rural, red versus blue, even within parties, Bernie versus Hillary. Most Americans don't wake up thinking of themselves that way. They wake up thinking about the debt they're carrying from their higher education, the insecurity they have about their job, hoping they don't have some sort of medical emergency or dealing with the one that they are going through. And I do think there are two Americas. It just doesn't fit into those dichotomies. There's Washington and the rest of us. I mean, look at how LA gets painted. I mean, the New York Times, it's always, we tease them because the article that came out a few weeks ago about how we didn't have strong institutions because of the tumult over the LA Times. I was going to write a note to my friend who wrote that, and I didn't have to because the comment section was like, are you kidding me? Like, you don't pass a Measure M if you have weak institutions. You don't have an art scene like we do if you have weak institutions. You don't win the Olympics if you have weak institutions. All this kind of stuff where people stood up for LA without any prompting from a politician. And I think we also know that despite people coloring us as a place that's just full of Hollywood stars, that we actually are a pretty working class town with nurses and factory workers, and that's who most of us are, bus drivers. And so that Americans aren't divided. We've got more Midwesterners here than most cities in the Midwest. You know, we actually know we are the heartland, and we're also Mexico and Armenia and Thailand. I mean, it's part of who we are. So I think that whoever comes next has to just speak some plain English to Americans and start talking about them. We certainly have a White House obsessed with itself, And I think it's fair to say on the Democratic side, we've had people who have been more focused in the mirror than on the people that we serve. And as a mayor, you can't do that. I have to take questions about the homeless people under the bridge. People find me at the grocery store and tell me about the pothole, what's not working at the park, in the bathroom. And I think we need leaders who kind of understand that that's what it's about. It's not about how much money you raise. It's not how many retweets you have. It's not about you framing the circus of the day. It's actually about what you produce. It's back to those A's that I said before, and the last one is action. Which is why I'd like to announce tonight that I'm running out of here when we're done.
All right. All right. Well, I think that that would conclude. I think that's our last question.
Is that a student?
Is that our last?
Was that a student back there? So one other hand.
Any students? Going once.
Come on, students. This is your chance.
This is your chance.
You can do it.
Okay.
There we go. We got one right there.
There it is. All right.
It's coming right there on your left. Tell us your name. Where are you from?
Jorge Acosta, college student from Los Angeles Harbor College. And my
Awesome.
question is, what are your future goals for the College Promise program for the future students to ensure success?
Awesome. So if people don't know what the College Promise movement is, Long Beach has had a great program for years. It started in Kalamazoo, Michigan. There's cities all around that basically said, if you graduate from local public high school, we'll pay for your college, usually starting with a community college. And nobody had ever done it with a really big city, but I kind of said, why not try to do it here in LA? We have pretty low tuition in the state of California. We looked at it, we raised the money privately for the initial year. And this year, any graduate of LAUSD this past fall was guaranteed admission, was guaranteed full tuition at any community college that they got into. And to give you an idea of what an impact it had in the first year, it increased by 40% the number of students from LAUSD who were going to our local community colleges. The assembly member for this area who used to serve on our community college district, Miguel Santiago, then took that and made it statewide legislation, which just passed. So starting this fall, any full-time, first-time community college student in California will get to go for free. So my goal this coming year is to take our money and give you a second year for free. But more than tuition, I also want to make sure we're helping you with books, we're helping you with transportation, housing. I'd like to work with this community college district to build housing. At LACC, Los Angeles City College, we were just looking at vets, and 20% of them were homeless while they're going to school. I mean, that's like folks who have fought for this country, who are furthering their education, and 20% of them were homeless. And we've got great land on our community colleges, but they haven't traditionally built dorms. But again, we can bring some of that HHH money that voters passed and maybe help young people not become homeless, foster aged youth that are emancipating, et cetera. And then my goal is, the third thing is to do things like what we're doing with the Pacific Council. I don't want you just to have tuition and your books covered. I want you to have opportunities that maybe nobody else in your neighborhood gave you an easy pathway to go on a trip with the Pacific Council, to go see another country, to understand global relations, to, if you want to be that next Secretary of State or global business magnate or whatever it is that you're going to do to help the world. So I really see this as the great equalizer. To the earlier question, to me, when I look back, what I'll judge my time on is not the nicest car that we produce, but how many people are still sleeping in a car. Not how great our food scene is, but who's hungry. And not whether we attract great talent, we always will, but whether we grow it up right here. And I think the College Promise will be a huge part of that legacy of saying, hey, the next Mark Zuckerberg is an African-American girl growing up in South LA. Or the next, President Obama is an immigrant from Thailand who had a dream to get involved in politics. Those things change if we make that investment, as we are with you, early on. So thank you for being here, and we believe in everything that you want to dream to do. Thank you.
All right. All right, so that I think really was, I want to be mindful of your time and everyone's time, so I think that really was the last question. So again, let's thank our mayor for spending time with us.
Thank you so much.
This evening. Yeah, not at all. Thank you. That was great. Thank you.